Welcome to the Programming Alliance podcast. Today we have James Lindsay joining us. He is a best-selling author, a published scholar, a mathematician. Further, James has been on some of the biggest media and podcasting stages in the world, talking about his insights into tricky topics like cultural Marxism, LGBT grooming, and other social cultural critiques. The boys also asked James some atypical questions that he doesn't normally get in interviews. So it's a great way to get to know him better. So let's get into it. James Lindsay, welcome to the Programming Alliance podcast. We are honored to have you on. And I got to say, this is unique for us. You have been, I think, a 4-time attendee on the Joe Rogan Experience. You've had your Twitter account taken down, reinstated by Elon Musk himself. You've spoken and debated in front of just about every crowd or group imaginable. And now you're on the Programming Alliance. It is really special to have somebody like yourself on with the reach and following that you have for a smaller show, a show that's growing. And it really means a lot because there's a lot of folks out there like us that feel like we see the truth and what is happening, and we're trying to build a resistance against all these crazy things that are happening. And so it's going to be really fun to talk to you about that today and get into it. So without further ado, boys, what kind of questions did we have for Mr. Lindsay?
So our first question is, with your degree in mathematics and physics, did you ever expect yourself to be doing what you are doing today?
The answer to that is definitely no. So when I was in high school, I actually wanted to be a meteorologist. And I wanted to study the weather. And I don't know if I wanted to be on the news. I wasn't necessarily wanting to be the weatherman on TV, which is kind of more of a communications thing. I wanted to study the weather. I wanted to do actual meteorology, study storms in particular, storm systems that move across, hurricanes. I was particularly interested in those kinds of things. Growing up here in the Southeast, we get a lot of kind of turbulent weather. So I was very fascinated with that. And then I took physics and I became enamored with physics. And I decided I wanted to be a physicist. I wasn't quite sure what a physicist did, but my dad was an engineer and it seemed kind of like somehow an upgrade above engineering to be a total scientist. And I started to look at some of the stuff that physicists did, studying, nuclear power and different things of that sort. And I thought, wow, that would be really cool. So I went to college and I picked my college based on having a strong physics program. And I studied physics. And in the middle of my third year in college, my junior year, I decided I did not like physics one bit. It was not something that I wanted to continue doing, but I did like math. And so I finished my degree because I'm not a quitter. And so I finished my bachelor's in physics and I changed my approach and applied to go to the Graduate School of Mathematics there at the same school. And at this point, I was pretty in love with math. I wanted to be a math teacher. I wanted to teach other people to see math the way that I was coming to see math and to see how interesting it's almost like a puzzle solving endeavor. It's not just answering these questions like you guys do at school. It's, these puzzles. And so I wanted to be a math professor. And so then I went off to do a doctorate at the University of Tennessee and studied math at that level. And I taught math the last couple of years of my last year of my master's degree, and then all through every semester that I did my PhD, I taught mathematics at the University of Tennessee. I also taught at a small college called Maryville College, where I filled in for a lady who was out for maternity leave and took a spot. They needed an adjunct professor to fill in for that. So I taught math at 3 colleges, and I loved teaching math. I did not like grading people's math homework or math tests, which they did not usually do very well on. But I really loved math and teaching math, but I didn't like being in the university. So I needed to figure out something else to do. And I never actually thought of anything else to do. I was always, once I started going to graduate school, I was always going to be a professor. And all of a sudden, I didn't want to be one anymore. So life was twisting me in a different direction. And there are reasons that have to do with my family, even. It turns out if you want to stay in an academic degree, you usually have to, after you finish your doctorate, your PhD, you have to go do things called postdocs. And then eventually you can get into something called a tenure track position, and you might or might not get that. And every one of those is at a different university, and you don't know where they'll be in advance. And so I thought, do I want to move my family around? I had two stepdaughters, roughly your guys' age at the time. They were just actually a little older. They were just starting high school. And I thought, do I want to be, let's put them through 3 high schools, all over the country, and just disrupt their whole social network and their friends and everything else, disrupt their lives? Or do I want to leave home to be able to pursue this for a few years, figure it out, and then we'll resettle somewhere else later? And I thought, no, I don't want to do any of that. And I was kind of sick of being in the university anyway. So I became a massage therapist. So I actually treated people who had muscle injuries and joint injuries for 10 years. And I had no idea that I was going to be somebody who was going to study political philosophy and communism and start trying to expose it to the world, until I kind of fell backwards into it. And then once I latched onto this, it's been very meaningful. It's been successful enough. And I'm very proud and happy to do the work that I do every day.
Okay. That's an interesting journey. So from
Wow.
mathematics to teaching to massage therapy to now essentially political activism. Yeah.
Yeah. So like kids, I know like my girls had a hard time with this, which was that when they were getting to be into high school, early 20s, they were just had this weird dead set mind that, well, I have to pick a career. That's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. No, you don't. You can just try things you think that are interesting, and after a few years, you'll build skills. You'll build, experience. You'll build people and networks. And after a few years, if you figure out that you don't really like that, you can actually change course until you find what you're going to be successful in. So my story is kind of like that. I just sort of bounced around between things, frankly, that I did at a high level, until I found something that's really meaningful and rewarding that I'm also successful at.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the thing that you didn't really like about physics?
So what I didn't like about teaching, I don't like colleges at all. I don't like being there. The outside is beautiful, but the inside feels very much like a school or like a government building. So I don't find it to be inspiring. But what was mostly happening was that there was a new priority in the teaching requirements, which was to make sure, because I taught mostly people who were what's called general education. So I taught people who were taking math classes, even though math wasn't part of their degree. And so they have to take one class so they can graduate in math. And I taught mostly those courses. And the policy became, don't fail anybody. You can only fail up to one student. And so I didn't know what to do when I would have these very bad students who I wasn't allowed to fail without creating an entire report on why I was going to fail a second or a third student, and go show it to the department or show it to the dean if it was serious enough. And so I thought, well, it's not the work that I objected to, it's the philosophy of that, which was, we were told, keep their spirits up, keep them happy to be there. Don't get them upset about their grades. Don't make them think it's too hard. Don't make them leave college. And it's because the college wanted to make money off of them. And I didn't want to participate in that. I wanted to teach people math. I didn't want to just be this person who shuttles them through in order for the university to be able to make money off of people so it can pay its bills. So that's what really ultimately disgusted me with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine.
So, you've co-written numerous fake articles. Did you ever expect any to get published?
No, I didn't. So for those of you guys out there who don't know what he's talking about, in 2017 and 18, I did what we called it the project. We just called it the project. That was a great code name for it. But we did this thing that came to be known as the Grievance Studies affair, where what we decided to do was that we had tried to criticize what we now call woke scholarship in the academic world. And they wouldn't accept our criticisms. Nobody would listen to us. They would accuse us of being white males, as though that discredits our opinions. And then they would say, well, you don't have a degree in it, so your opinion doesn't count. You're not an expert. And so we thought, well, if we publish research papers in the field, then clearly we know the field, and people can see that, and then they might listen to our criticisms. Plus, we'll embarrass them and expose that the peer review system there is not very good. So we did that project, and we wrote 20 papers over the course of a year and a half, or a year really. We wrote all the papers in a 1-year span. The project itself lasted about 16 months, so just under a year and a half. And we actually wrote 20 of them, and 7 of them got accepted. 4 of them were actually published. 7 more were still under consideration. 6 were rejected outright, and we didn't try to salvage them. And so we were remarkably successful at penetrating the peer review in fields like gender studies and feminism and critical race theory and education theory in a kind of an alarming way. So the question was, did I expect any of those papers would get published? And the answer was no. In fact, I was remarkably pessimistic. My friend Peter and I were kind of the prime drivers of that project. Helen helped as well, and very significantly, not to diminish her role. But Peter and I were definitely the instigators and the drivers. And Peter was convinced that if we worked hard enough, we could get 2 or 3 published. And I was very pessimistic and said, no, we're going to get 0. We're just going to embarrass ourselves. This is never going to work. And I was incorrect. I was wrong. And actually, Peter was too. We actually became rampantly successful. We became extremely successful.
Some of these were so absurd. I'm more familiar with this than the boys, but what would you say was the most absurd paper you had published?
They're all pretty absurd. Probably the most absurd one is the most famous of the papers, which is the infamous dog park paper, which Joe Rogan laughs about every time I talk to him. He still brings it up. He texts me sometimes just to if he sees something related to it, because he gets laughing about it. But we wrote that there's this concept in feminism called rape culture, that people are positively supportive of, letting men get away with sexual assault. Yep. And we said, well, one way that you could evaluate people's attitudes toward it is watch how dogs behave in dog parks when they do their business with each other, whether it's fighting or other things. Yep. And we claimed that we analyzed thousands and thousands of these incidents spanning over 10,000 or just under 10,000 dogs in a handful of dog parks in Oregon over the course of a year, in which we said in Portland, Oregon, that we spent 1,000 hours in dog parks, but never in the heavy rain. There's not 1,000 hours of not raining in Portland in a year anyway. I don't know how in the world they bought this. And so we concluded, though, that the best way to overcome male misbehavior in the world would be to train men the way that we train dogs, using leashes and shock collars and obedience manual training and that kind of thing. So train men like we train dogs. And this paper wasn't just accepted by the leading journal in what's called feminist geography. It was actually given an award for excellence in scholarship, and was going to be given this kind of huge status in their flagship journal, which was shocking to us when we found out that they thought it was like the best of the best for that year. That was probably the most absurd paper, but they were all really absurd in their own ways.
Yeah. It's incredible. Well, thank you for the great work on exposing some of this idiocracy that's happening. Yeah. And in fact, that's a great film. The boys and I watched Idiocracy not too long ago. I'm sure you've seen it, but a lot of this
is what plants crave.
Exactly.
Give them water. You mean out of the toilet?
Exactly. Yeah, we talk about feeding the plants Gatorade, boys. Maybe they all need electrolytes, right? So,
water.
Do you guys know what electrolytes are?
Yes, we put they're basically salt. It's like salt.
Yeah, it's salt.
And
that's
you
right.
Put them a little bit into your water. So then,
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
let's move on. We want to pick your brain a bit, James, on communism, Marxism. I don't know anybody that knows this field in more detail than you do, so let's get into some of those questions, boys.
Okay. Do you think that this divisiveness has been an ongoing operation to destroy America?
That's exactly what I think it is, yeah. So since you wanted to talk specifically about communism or Marxism, I'll tell you straight from the very beginning, communism and Marxism were outlined by a man named Karl Marx. And Karl Marx wrote a very famous document in 1848 called the Communist Manifesto that lays out what it's supposed to be about. He wrote that with his co-author Friedrich Engels. And the very first paragraph of the first chapter lays out the idea of communism in terms of divisiveness. He says that all of human history is the conflict of classes. So what it means is that there are some people, he says, that are in the oppressed category and other people who are oppressing them, who are oppressors. And the entire history of mankind is the evolution of oppressed versus oppressor conflict. And so the whole point of communism is to get people to understand themselves in terms of different identities that don't get along with one another, that enact conflict with one another. That's actually the whole point, because the idea that Karl Marx had was that history is this kind of phenomenon that people go through. But there was prehistory, before history, where we all lived in different tribes, and every tribe was like a big family, and nobody had any property. Everybody shared everything. But the problem was they were small. There were maybe a couple hundred people, or even just 100 people per tribe, and they didn't know each other. They didn't share across the tribes, and they lived very primitive lives. And then it comes along into a period of time where people claim, I own this and you don't own that. In other words, private property exists.
Mm-hmm.
And once the private property enters into the equation, what Marx said is there's the people who have it, and then there's the people who don't, and they're intrinsically in conflict. And the period of time when that's what's believed is history. So in prehistory, people didn't believe that, but they didn't have a advanced society. They had a primitive society, and then people believed that, and it allowed the society to start to advance to a high level. Like we have computers, and we have jet airplanes, and we have cars, and we have all this great technology. We have entertainment, we have great music. All of those things didn't exist in the primitive condition. And what Marx said is, well, history eventually can end. It can go back to a situation where everybody shares everything and we don't fight over who owns what. There's no more class conflict, in other words. And that at that point, it's not history anymore. History has reached its conclusion, and the end of history is called communism, where there's no government, everybody just gets along. There are no classes, so there's no conflict, and everybody gets along, and everybody shares, and everybody owns everything equally. And so the idea is that all of history itself is the history of conflict, and the point is to make that conflict move until it ends. And so what it does when it takes over a country or comes into a country, or into even a school or into a business or into an institution, is it creates the conflict, because the conflict itself is supposed to be the vehicle that moves it. And then the idea is that the communists will make sure as it moves in the correct direction. They're like the people steering the car. The conflict is the engine driving the car, and they're like the people steering the car to make sure it goes toward communism. And so the political divisiveness that we see, the polarization, the fighting, the disagreeing, the families and friends alienating from one another, cutting people out of their lives, is all a result of the basic theory of communism put into practice. And so its purpose is to create that, and it's created that in America. And the goal is actually to tear apart the existing country, to put it into a different form. The way Marx phrased that in that same opening paragraph to the Communist Manifesto is he says that conflict always results either in the revolutionary reconstitution of the society or the common ruin of the contending classes. So what that means is that either you're going to have a revolution in which there's an entirely new government program that runs everything in a different phase of conflict, or maybe the end of conflict, or you're just going to destroy everything.
Yeah. It's
Wow.
it's terrifying. We didn't watch this with the boys, but my wife and I watched Beneath Sheep's Clothing, which is a great film, by the way. And you have a major part in describing some of these things, but it's terrifying when you guys break down some of the things that are happening, and particularly in America. And we may watch that with the boys. I know there was some kind of guidance that you got to be careful, but I didn't find it to be too graphic or anything. So
yeah, that's
anyway,
definitely a dad's discretion question.
Yes, I agree. In every case where this has been tried, and there's a lot of people that are still promoting Marx ideologies. In fact, we get them in our threads constantly. When you start prioritizing the collective over the individual, you start pushing down progress and ingenuity, and so then it ends up just going in this downward spiral, like down the toilet. People still want to keep trying it. I don't understand this.
Well, it's a cult. And so if you are in a cult that believes that the UFOs are going to come, like Leon Festinger studied in 1950 something. He infiltrated a UFO cult, and the UFO cult believed something like that these aliens were coming and they were going to rescue the faithful and destroy the planet, something like
Yeah.
that. And I might have the details of what the cult actually believed wrong, but we'll use that as a stand-in. And so they were in this cult, and they all believed in this UFO story that the humanity was going to be wiped out by powerful aliens, but the people who had the right view would be saved and taken off in the spaceships with the aliens before the world got destroyed. And then the day they predicted what day this was supposed to happen, and Leon Festinger and another researcher infiltrated. They joined the cult. They pretended to be part of the cult. They did everything with the cult the way they were supposed to blend in, and they recorded what was going on. But what they were interested in is what would happen when the day came and the aliens didn't show up.
Right.
And so the day came and they all went out in a field or something and, built a bonfire, waited for the aliens to pick them up. And then obviously nothing happened.
Right.
The aliens never showed up. The world didn't get destroyed. Everything was fine. And so the next morning, here they are, and they've crashed into reality. They had this belief that this was going to happen, and reality came in and said, that's not what's going to happen. So this is like communists thinking they're going to get the utopia, the perfect society. Millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people die or get killed, and it's brutal totalitarianism. And what happened with the UFO cult with Leon Festinger was that most of the people, but not all of the people, just threw up their hands and was like, whatever, it's over, right? We were wrong, and they went on with their lives and had to try to correct themselves. But a pretty strong contingent, something like 15 or 20% of the original cult, did not do that. They came together and they tried to make sense of what had happened, and they decided that what had actually occurred was that the alien spaceship came and that they saw how faithful the people were, and they saw that there was a remnant of humanity that was actually good. And they said, well, we won't destroy the planet. So they came and they flew away, which is something that you can't prove or disprove.
Right.
Well, the communists try this, and socialism falls on its face, and millions of people die, mostly of starvation. Many are murdered. Millions are murdered.
Yeah.
And they have this total collapse of their society. And then their excuse is, well, real communism has not yet been tried. What we tried was an attempt, but it wasn't the real thing. We failed because the real thing wasn't there. And this is actually why I think most of the people, why communism spirals so out of control and kills so many people.
Yeah.
Because the way their belief system works is what Karl Marx actually said before he wrote the Communist Manifesto, is that you have to have a transformation of the individual person. He called it a positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement. That's his exact wording. And he says it's also a complete return of man to his true social nature, which is his true human nature. So man becomes who he really is, returns to his true nature, and we have a completely changed person in every person in a completely changed society. And Marx said that's when it's going to work. And so everybody has to now transform themselves in a religious way or a cult way, have different values, different beliefs, different activities. And then what happens is it doesn't work. It actually doesn't work. But if you're in that cult mindset, the reason it doesn't work is because there are still people out there who didn't change their minds yet, or didn't change their hearts, actually. They still have selfish, capitalist, or feudal, or bourgeois, or whatever beliefs. And so the problem must be that there are people who aren't on the program good enough yet. And the only thing to do is find those people and get rid of them.
Yes.
You can re-educate them, you can exile them, or you can kill them. And that's basically all you end up with as options.
Yeah. And boys, for you, like an example of this that you might be familiar with is during COVID, right? Remember how people talked about the unvaccinated?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
didn't care if they died, didn't want to keep hospital beds open for them, and had really rotten things to say. This is essentially like what James is describing is you dehumanize people that don't go along with the plan.
Yeah,
then,
so the plan there was that when we had when everybody did their part, everybody wore a mask, everybody did social distancing, everybody got their shots that they were supposed to get. Everybody did everything they were told, and knowing that some people weren't going to do it. But when everybody did it, then what would happen is we would stop the virus. And when the virus stopped, then we could go back to life as normal. And then, of course, we weren't given life back as normal. For a very long time, the policy was still there. People were still getting sick. The virus was still there. And so what they did was they taught people to blame the people who didn't do what they were supposed to do.
Right.
Oh, the reason we still have COVID is because some people won't wear masks, or because some people won't get their shots, or because some people won't social distance, or because some people do this or do that, or take the wrong medicine or whatever else. And then they taught people to blame their bad experience, which was the lockdowns, the masks, getting sick, and the virus, all that bad experience. They taught them to blame it on the people who weren't doing what they were told.
Yeah.
And so that's where the totalitarians get power, because now they can say this is what everybody has to do and everything will be good when everybody does it. But there's a small group of people, or maybe even a large group of people, who won't do it, and they're causing all of your problems. So you have to blame them. You have to tell them to do it. You have to push them around, bully them. You have to get them fired from their jobs, all the different stuff that happened in COVID. So that's actually textbook totalitarianism, or textbook communist activity that you guys actually lived through.
Right.
And we all lived through with the policy around the COVID-19 virus.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this might be a good segue into another potential example.
So, the LGBTQ plus IA, whatever. I want your take of, is it a terrorist organization?
Well, no, it's not a terrorist organization, but it's a complicated thing, because all of those letters represent something different, right? L stands for lesbian, G stands for gay, B stands for bisexual. That's actually sexual orientations, as they're called. So that's how people are attracted to other people. And then you have transgender, that's the T, and that's fundamentally different. That has to do with what they call gender identity. It's not at all to do with who you're attracted to, for whatever the reasons are. And then you have the magic important word, which is Q. All the other stuff after that's less important, because Q is an ideology. It is a political belief. It's, in fact, a form of Marxism that uses gender and sexuality as its main vehicles. And so what you actually have, you don't have actually a real organization at all. You have this coalition. All those different letters are put together. So the way I usually put it is that the L, the G, and the B in particular, lesbians, gays, bisexuals, are like human shields that the radicals in the queer ideology are hiding behind.
Yes.
Now, those people are subversives. They're Marxists. They don't necessarily know that they're Marxists, although many of them are explicitly Marxist. And some of them are radical destabilizers, or Antifa, or actual terrorists, or they work with terrorists, like the so-called Queers for Palestine thing.
Mm-hmm.
They are the radical dangerous group, and they are hiding behind, and I left out the T because it's complicated, and it's actually very complicated there, but they're certainly hiding behind everyday normal Americans that are trying to live their lives without any hassle, and happen to be attracted to people that aren't the opposite sex for whatever reason, whatever that happens to be. Some of the literature calls it a choice. Some of the literature says they're born that way. I don't think we actually know the answer to that question. We don't know if it's caused, what it's caused by, or if it's always caused by the same thing. But those are normal people trying to live their lives like normal people. And then you have a group which is symbolized by that letter Q, which stands for queer, which is explicitly a political movement that's hiding behind those normal people. So when Mao Zedong in China took over in the 1940s, when he was doing his military conquest of China to set up the Communist Party of China as the ruling party, he was fighting against what was called the Nationalist Party. So in Chinese, that's called the Kuomintang. And so the Kuomintang controlled, the nationalists controlled most of China. And there was actually a military campaign being run by the Communist Party to take over, headed by Mao. And so what would happen is that this military would march in, take over a town or a village or a county or a province, and he would take all the innocent people and he'd put them out in front and make them carry all of the gear as they marched, the tents, the extra water, the food, as they marched to the next town or the next village or the next province. So you have a wall of innocent people marching in front of the army. And so when the nationalists had to defend themselves against the incoming army, all they could shoot, when they would shoot their guns, all they could shoot were innocent people from the next side over. And I feel the very same way about this, that you have the T and the Q back behind LGB, and they're marching into things. And so when people try to fight back, they hit the L, they hit the G, they hit the B, but they're not able to get down to the to the Q, to the queer theorists, the queer
Yeah.
activists who are actually pushing it. And so I think of it that way. And in that sense, you could say that the Q represents something very much like a terrorist organization that's using these other identities in front of it to be able to stay protected. And I think that that's actually a very good way to put it. But LGBTQ itself doesn't exist. That is a made up acronym that doesn't represent a actual coalition of people. It represents a fake or an artificial coalition that was cobbled together so that the real activists, the radicals, could hide behind normal people.
Wow, that's deep.
It is deep.
I mean,
That's a really interesting way to think about it, and I like that take because we've talked about this a bit as a family because we have, I would say, generally conservative values in terms of our belief system and our value system, and we care about all people, love all people, and we don't have issues with people loving who they want to love. But then there's this other aspect of the group that we do have ideological differences with. And when we voice those, the whole swarm sort of comes at us. And we've seen
That's
this
right.
on our social media page. And it's crazy. It's toxic. They're really well organized. Like you wouldn't
I
believe
can
some of the
relate.
things.
I get the same experience. I get attacked as being anti-LGBTQ, and I try to tell people that I'm iffy on the T and I'm anti-Q.
Yes.
But I don't know
yes.
about the rest of it. I'm fine with the rest of it as long as. So for me, there's two lines, right? The two lines are: do you know the difference between public and private? What you do in private is different than what you do in public.
Yeah.
And most people in America today are only modestly concerned or not concerned at all with what people do in private. Just don't
Right.
put it out on the street. And then
Yeah.
the second line is, do you understand the difference between adult and children? So, for example, with all of this drag queen story hour,
Yeah.
I mean, your opinions may differ, but it doesn't matter. But it's something fundamentally different between doing this in a 21 and up nighttime adult environment, say in Las Vegas or San Francisco or New York or any other place, and then putting it in a public library in the middle of the day for children. There's a
Yeah.
big difference between, is this an adult space where it's vetted, people have showed their IDs and proven that they're adults, or is this being presented to people who are underage? And if you can stay on the right side of both of those lines, you understand that there's adult content for adults and that's not appropriate for children, and you understand that there is a difference between what you do in public and what you do in private, and you can navigate that, then I think I feel this way, and I think most Americans agree that it's not a major concern in our lives what happens within those private or
Yeah.
properly coded off spaces. Now, if you have Christian values, you might be concerned about the behavior, but there are appropriate and friendly and welcoming ways to deal with that. But when it's shoved vigorously into the public space and into your face and into your children's lives, you have to defend your kids. So it creates this whole dynamic of conflict. Again, we come back to the conflict, and you can see who's generating the conflict by putting the provocation out where it doesn't belong. Where if they had kept it within boundaries that most Americans at least, generally accept, it probably
Yeah.
never would have become a flashpoint or an issue of conflict.
Yeah, and I think the guardrails that you just mentioned are largely acceptable by most standards of Americans and people that I know. But it's definitely pushed beyond that. And I'm sure you've got this. You authored a book, Queering of the Kids, which we've read, not the boys, but I have. And yes, there's this push or drive to get kids introduced to some of these ideas earlier and earlier. And we, as parents, obviously, we want to protect them from that because it doesn't match up with us. When we say something about that publicly on our social media, or the boys do in one of our posts, the attack is like severe, rampant, like hive mind, and it's incredibly toxic and hateful. Like I'm sure you've gotten a crazy amount of trolls and hate, but for an account that has kids on the face of it, we've had death threats, we've had calls for post-birth abortion, we've had calls for grotesque sexual acts to be done on these two children. And I can't wrap my head around a group that bases their ideology on love and tolerance and acceptance, that they don't accept our beliefs on this and we must comply. And so this is where it comes back to this like communist Marxist idea, like we must comply and accept this thing and this moving guardrail, or we will be outcasts, shamed, hated, and put out in the public square on trial, right? Like it's
Yeah, I mean, I could give you a pretty deep description, I guess to use the word, about how they think about tolerance and what tolerance is about, and that's comes from a radical in the 1960s who wrote an essay called Repressive Tolerance. Or we could just make it a lot simpler and say Marxists always lie. They say it's about tolerance and love. It's not always it's about tolerance and love. It's about affirmation and celebration of them. It is a narcissistic approach as opposed to a genuine approach to what they consider love. And that actually raises a very important point about why this particular community can be so overwhelmingly toxic and violent, which is that it actually overwhelmingly attracts people who have legitimate psychological medical conditions called personality disorders. There's a lot of people in this community who have borderline or antisocial personality. There's a lot of narcissists who it's all about them. And when these people are not getting their psychological disorder properly taken care of, which they express through queer theory, because it turns out that queer theory is supposed to give a voice to the outsiders. Well, the mentally ill are outside the mainstream of society. When these people don't get what they want out of the situation, what I say is when they're not given 120% of everything they want all the time, they react vigorously, viciously. The hive mind effect is strong. And then they have a huge coterie of people around them, a lot of whom, believe it or not, are mostly women in their 60s and 70s who were the
Yeah.
old hippies in the 60s and the 70s who
Yep.
are now old, but they're also a big contingent of younger, especially not just, there's some men, but mostly women who were raised on this image in the 90s and early 2000s of the evil Christian conservative dad who would disown his kids. And so this value of inclusion, that you would dare say somebody's not welcome into our community, even if they're literally dangerously crazy. They're so afraid that they were going to get accused of not being inclusive themselves that they lash out when they see somebody who's not doing it. And I think that explains a lot of the toxicity of that group. You say, I have a lot of haters and trolls. I certainly do. This is actually what I got kicked off of Twitter for 5 months before Elon brought me back. But the fact of the matter is, I've never seen such angry, literally grandparents and primarily women going to war over this particular issue. And I think it's their old hippie days from the 70s and 60s being relived in this kind of very low information, low understanding of what's really going on, thinking love is really the expression, not understanding that this is something much more damaging.
Yeah, there's something much more sinister to aspects of this in our experience. So I like the thread that we're on with LGBT, and this brings up another issue, which is culture wars. Some people think the culture wars are a myth. I happen to think they're more real, but I'm curious from your perspective, are the culture wars real, and are conservatives losing?
Not anymore. The culture war wars are real, or is real, however you want to phrase it. It's got to be characterized correctly. What's actually occurring is there is an attempted, using the woke versions, these identity politics versions of Marxism, there is an attempted Marxist revolution happening in the United States. It's not a violent revolution, a military revolution. It's a cultural revolution. And so there's an attempted cultural revolution happening to transform American values right out from underneath us. And that has been pretty successful by the Marxists and by the left more broadly. But it's not going so well anymore. Americans have woke up to what's happening. They are now aware. They're not just feeling like, hey, something's wrong. Millions of Americans can give voice to what it is. They can describe what it is. And in fact, it's turning out that the conservative side is starting to appear far more cool than the the left side is. The left side feels like somebody just opened up an old can of tuna and shook it out and said, there's your dinner at this point. Whereas the conservative side seems to be doing things that are real, that are authentic, that are enriching, that are interesting. And so I actually think that if you would have asked this question maybe 2.5 years ago, I would have said, yeah, so far we've lost most of the cultural institutions.
Yes.
We've also lost a grip on culture, but I don't think that's happening anymore. I think that the culture is coming back the other direction. I see an amazing revival of American values,
Yeah.
people wanting America to be America again.
Right.
A lot of people like the Make America Great Again MAGA thing, but
Yeah.
there's another thing that I see hats. I have one. Somebody gave me a hat. Make America America Again. I see
Yeah.
American flags flying places I didn't see them. The fireworks on the 4th of July they used to be a thing. Like, some people did it. And now every 4th of July we go out, my wife and I do, we post up in the driveway and we're just surrounded. Every neighbor's just going crazy. Somebody's blasting America the Beautiful or the Star Spangled Banner over a loudspeaker.
Yeah.
There's this revival of America that's
Well,
happening. And so I don't think we're losing anymore, but the
That's
culture
great
wars are
to hear
real
from
and they
somebody-
are a cultural revolution we're responding to.
Yeah. I appreciate that. It's great to hear that optimism coming from you, who's really like at the center of a lot of this. And I guess for me, it's been a little challenging because I see so many people still not speaking up things like aspects of LGBT, ESG, DEI, all of these sort of non-merit based programs, social scoring and crediting of people. And when I mention these things to people, they're like, oh yeah, we agree with you, Matt. We love your show. What you guys are doing is great. And I said, oh, okay, well, you want to come on? You want to talk about it? Or feel free to jump on and say you agree with it. Oh, I can't do that. I can't.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a ton of people that say, I can't do that. Or if I post something on LinkedIn, more of a business social site, right? I will not get any comments on some of our content or guests because there still is this massive fear of if I say anything against DEI, LGBT, ESG, buzzwords and terms, that they will be ridiculed and their future earnings will be at risk, et cetera, et cetera. You know the drill.
Oh, yeah.
And so I still see a ton of that. And it's very troubling to me to see that people don't feel like they can tell the truth. I certainly felt like this. It's a big reason why I'm not in the corporate world anymore. And I'm doing this with my kids because I was so worried about how they're going to grow up and what their culture is going to be like and the future of America for Gen Alpha, which these kids are in. So at any rate, what are your thoughts about people getting more courage to stand up to some of these bad ideas? There's a lot of people that definitely disagree with it, but they are unwilling to take the risk.
Well, in a sense, there's kind of, I don't know, we'll say 3 different groups. I think it's more complicated than that. I don't want to oversimplify, but there's the people who actually agree with this stuff. Then there are the people who disagree but keep their mouths shut. And then there are the people who disagree and are willing to open their mouths. And what I've noticed is that both of those second 2 groups are growing, and that group of people who agree with it is shrinking. And I couldn't possibly be more frustrated with the people who disagree with everything with this DEI and all the woke and all of this, who are afraid to speak up still. It's, we're putting our necks out and we're taking the arrows. And if we win, let's say, they get to just kind of skate by having never put any skin in the game. And it's all very irritating. And we all know that it would be easier and it would be done faster if more people got involved.
Yes.
But what I'm seeing is, as somebody who started giving speeches on this in 2017, 7 years now, I've been talking about this in public.
Yeah.
It can only be described as a groundswell of people who are willing to show up, who are willing to speak up, who are willing to get involved in it. It's one thing to show up or speak up. It's one thing to get involved on social media. It's another thing to decide to run for office. It's another thing to decide to get directly involved in a community organization, to build an organization. This is exploding, and it has been exploding for a while. I used to feel like I was standing face to face with a storm, a stiff wind blowing in my face. And it was like I was yelling and my own voice was getting blown back in my face.
Sure.
And now it feels like there's a hurricane to my back. So it's definitely changed. And I've seen that change I have visited 44 of the states. I'll pick up 45 here in a few weeks. So I'm very encouraged.
Yeah.
It's frustrating with these people who are silent, but more and more of them are starting to be willing to take that step.
Yeah.
Or what they're hitting is they've just had enough of it. One time too many. They're
Right.
just like they've had enough of it. What's interesting though is in the corporate world, right? This is going to sound funny because I'm going to use the word in a different way than we usually think. But corporations are very conservative. And I don't mean conservative values like we would talk about as conservative values. Don't rock the boat. So whatever's happening, whatever the inertia is now, just don't step out of line. Nobody lose your job. Nobody take a risk. It's kind of ironic that corporations, which are designed to diffuse liability, are extremely risk averse entities. And right now, the incentive structures for the past decade or decade and a half around corporations have all been built in the direction of sustainability. They've all been built in the direction of inclusion and DEI. And not many people are willing to rock the boat yet because of that extraordinary maintain the status quo inertia culture around corporate behavior and institutional behaviors, bureaucratic behaviors the same way. But at major industry conventions in multiple different industries, what I'm hearing is that the stage and the crowd are no longer in sync. So the stage is saying, we're going to be more sustainable. We're going to be more inclusive. And everybody's kind of nodding along. And then at lunch, everybody's like, this is crap. It doesn't work.
Right.
This is a big problem. And they're all waiting for somebody to be the first person in their industry to speak up. What I'm hearing actually is a lot of vice presidents of companies are starting to get cold feet about all this and saying something needs to change. So even that apparatus is starting to rattle. If that disconnect has happened between the stage and the crowd at industry meetings, something's moving. So I remain optimistic. I don't think it's going to be fast. Especially in those particular industries, people will not move until effectively they feel like it's safe and there's they have permission to do so. But the condition, those of us who are risking our livelihoods, our well-being to do this, are creating those conditions for that to occur. And as frustrating as it is for us, we're playing an essential role that I think is bearing fruit, just not as quickly as we would hope.
Okay. I love hearing that. Actually,
I do too, honestly. Like, I mean, as people have told me this disconnect is growing, I've finally started to feel optimistic and confident.
yeah, that's incredible. And it makes me feel better about jumping out and taking some of the risks that we've taken, and really encouraging, very encouraging.
Okay. So, is today turning to be like Star Wars, the Empire against the Resistance or Rebels?
James, are you a Star Wars fan?
I am an old Star Wars fan, but
Okay.
I jumped ship somewhere in those so-called prequels. Somewhere between episode 1 and 2. I watched half of episode 2 and I've just said, I don't need this anymore. So the old,
Really?
4, 5, and 6, Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, Han Solo, Princess Leia, keep it simple. Got Chewie running around. Yes. Grew up on
like
that.
it.
Still think it's cool.
Okay. Well, so these are maybe more of the prequel type things, but when you see how Emperor Palpatine kind of put all of this in motion, right? He created the Republic and the clone army. He also was leading up the other army with General Grievous, and so he was essentially creating this conflict so that conflict would eventually give him executive powers through the Senate. And then at the Senate, when the war was going and he needed complete control to win the war through this crisis that was created, he stated, we will bring peace to the galaxy, right, through power, basically. And so the kids and I have talked about Star Wars, and we love our Star Wars films. It's actually, to me, a very real example of how communism can take place and how crisis can create these opportunities for somebody to get power, and then the empire and the republic. And now you've got stormtroopers at every corner watching what you do, censoring what you do, making sure that you don't step out of line, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's this small resistance trying to fight back. And what we also talk about is the fact that today, so many people are actually voting, in my opinion, for the empire. They're voting for their own enslavement, which I think is wild. It's like in every movie ever, people are rooting for the resistance, but in real world, they're rooting for the empire.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with both of those points, as a matter of fact. Although, again, with the voting for the empire, I actually think that there is some awakening happening, and we're seeing that not just in the United States. Right now, I don't know how far across Canada it will reach when it comes to their election, but in British Columbia alone, there's about to be an election, and the Liberal Party of Canada is about to lose an unbelievable number of seats. So that shows a massive shift in Canadian politics. I've been personally on the ground in parts of Canada and actually helped with that to some degree. So I'm excited to see it certainly happening in the United States. It appears with at least the polling and the energy around our election this year. We've seen it happening in European countries, although with mixed results in terms of the people who actually end up in power. We've seen it happen in Argentina with Javier Milei. Something's occurring. So there's hope there. But I think for the last while, for certain people, and certainly in the last two elections in the United States and across Canada and across Europe, there's been a lot of voting for the empire. But you're right. The way that actually has been set up was through the technical philosophical term for that is dialectical conflict, right? This is what Marx was talking about, is that you set up two factions that you actually control both of to create a conflict or a war so that you can use the conflict as a pretext to grab power like Palpatine did and I'm familiar-ish with the story, with the background lore, even though I gave up on the movies. So that's not only a well-worn political strategy to power if you can finagle it. It is also exactly what's happening, is that people talk about the so-called rhinos, Republican in name only. Well, what we had for a long time were Democrats that push a particular way, Republicans who fight back against them, but then when it actually matters, they vote together on all the stuff that cheats the American public of its liberty.
Yeah.
That's a long-standing communist strategy. Vladimir Lenin, when he was taking over Russia in the early 20th century, said the easiest way, or the best way, I should say, to control the opposition is to become the opposition ourselves.
Yeah.
And then there's an organization in England called the Fabian Society, which that's kind of highbrow to talk about, but the Fabian Society has that exact same mentality. They're going to infiltrate both political parties and create the idea of political division where actually when it comes to the point they actually agree. So they pretend to fight about stuff, but then they get the same job done, and that job is always to create a crisis situation, a border crisis, a immigration crisis, a crime crisis, a political division crisis, whatever it happens to be, a climate crisis, or at least an appearance, and then to claim the need for power to be able to bring peace back onto the table. And I think that they've been playing both sides that way for a long time. I think that they're going to attempt to play both sides that way in a new way now, because it's the oldest trick in the book, basically. And Star Wars is a perfectly good metaphor for a very complicated kind of political thing, which is that it's not always the good guys versus the bad guys. Sometimes there is a good guy, and then there are two bad guys who look like they're against each other. And you don't know who you're supposed to trust or side with. And I think that actually sets up, like you said, a great teaching tool. As far as voting for the empire, the old trade-off is always, and we talked about this in the founding fathers, talked about this in the founding of America. The classical liberals in England before the founding of America talked about this, is that there's always a trade-off between liberty and safety. If everything is under control, it feels more safe. And so if the government's there to take care of you, everything can be safe. And that's the sales pitch anyway. It doesn't work that way in practice. But liberty, unfortunately, if you are free, then you will also have to be responsible. Nobody's here to take care of you. Nobody's here to protect you. So you have to have enough responsibility, whether it's to use, let's say it's something simple, like you want to clean up your neighborhood after a storm with a chainsaw. Chainsaw is a dangerous thing. If you don't know how to handle the chainsaw responsibly, if you haven't learned how to use the chainsaw, then it's a very dangerous implement. You could hurt yourself, you could hurt other people, you could do damage. So it requires responsibility to handle it correctly. And if you're just free to use a chainsaw with no responsibility, oh no, what bad things could happen? So maybe the state would step in and say, well, they're too dangerous. So people aren't allowed to use chainsaws anymore. And now we have to wait for the state to come in to clean up after the storm, which is exactly what we're seeing the problem in North Carolina after Hurricane Helene and the flooding. And we're not seeing that problem in Florida after Hurricane Milton because Governor Ron DeSantis said, no, we're going to clean up after a hurricane like we always clean up after a hurricane, and good people who have done this are going to come out. But why do people vote for safety over liberty? Because they know that they have to grow up, they have to be responsible, they have to have skills, they have to be able to provide and protect themselves in a situation where people are free. And it's just in a very kind of low level of understanding way, it's just simpler. It's easier to have the empire take care of everything.
Yeah.
When I've been to China, and I'll shut up after that, half the people I talk to, I've been to China 7 times. I've talked to a lot of people. Half the people I talk to roughly, in their 20s or 30s, that age group, say things like, don't let America fall. It's the last place of freedom. We're all kind of hoping, and we need you to stay together. And about half of the people say things, and I mean quite literally, like, we like the government because everything when they tell us what to do, it's just one less thing we have to think about for ourselves. They make it easier, but they also take away your freedom, and they can force you to do things that are bad or harmful or that steal your ability to live a fulfilling life. And so a lot of people fall on the wrong side of that trade-off because they want to be taken care of.
It's wild to me that a lot of people just want to be taken care of instead of taking ownership over their own destiny. But it is a fact of life that a lot of people like the simplicity of that and the ease of that. And it is easier. And so there's, I suppose, always going to be a number of people that fall into that category.
Yeah, the thing is that it's easier till it goes sideways. And it always goes sideways because the government has a million reasons, including corruption, including trying to maintain its own power, and including not having the correct incentive structures to provide security or services. It has a million different reasons why it's going to fail in the mission. It has a nice sales pitch of security, but it's going to fail in that mission. And that's, of course, the amazing vision of the American founders, was know that people taking care of themselves is the best way for people to take care of themselves.
And if you do it long enough, there's nobody that wants to take care of themselves because there's no benefits to doing that. And then you drown out ingenuity and productivity, and then you run out of people to leech off of to keep society moving.
So what you end up with practically is like China, where they end up somehow getting a hold of nuclear submarine plans and technology, and they build their first super great nuclear submarine. They just did this. And so they have the plans that they basically stole. They stole the technology. Of course, they know how to build things in China. They build things faster than anybody else in the world because they're a totalitarian government. But they build this submarine, and what does it do? Sinks at the dock. It just sinks immediately. The thing didn't work because they actually they don't have any ingenuity. They don't have any problem solving. They have this plan that they then followed, and they probably didn't follow it fully correctly, and they didn't have the problem solving ability. And so they build this extraordinarily expensive ship that's supposed to be super high technology that we were hoping they wouldn't have. And the first thing it does, and I mean literally first thing it does, is sinks to the bottom and is destroyed.
Yeah. Wild. Well, how about this? Let's transition into a fun section. The boys have a couple questions, and then we'll do our rapid fire section, which is some oddball, quick questions, and we'll wrap it up.
Okay.
Cool.
So our first one is, we have all talked about a lot of very serious topics in this whole conversation, and I am wondering, what are some fun things that you like to do, like on your own?
I like to go outside. I like to go for long walks outside, and sometimes with my wife, sometimes by myself. So I like to spend a lot of time exercising. I work out almost every day. A lot of people know I practice martial arts, so I like to practice martial arts, and I have a relatively modest collection of swords that I like to play with and use. Some of them are sharp, some of them are not. Hang on a second. I'm willing to bet you've not seen a sword this big before.
That is a sword.
Is that a sharp one?
No.
Like you could cut something?
No, this sword's not sharp,
You
but
can
it is
injure
5
someone.
feet and some odd inches long.
Wow.
That's crazy.
It's about your
And
height,
it's
Will.
very heavy. So it's a very good workout to use it. And I train with that sometimes. Like I said, almost every single day I go out and I work out. Recently, every now and then I have the good fortune to travel to another country and for work. And I've been to a lot of countries now. I was in Japan, which I very much liked. And so I'm learning to make Japanese foods that I ate while I was there that I didn't know how to make before. So I like to do things in the kitchen. I think that's fun. But before that, I went to Korea in August and I had a great time in Korea and I loved my time in Korea. And I was only there for a couple of days, but it was fantastic. So one of my hobbies right now is trying to learn Korean. And it turns out that's a very hard language. We're not getting very far. So don't ask me to say anything in Korean because we're not getting very far with that. It's extremely hard, but I like these kind of intellectual challenges for something to do that's fun. And like I said, I go out, I lift weights, I work out, I try to do it outside in nature whenever I can. The gym is fine, but I'd rather be outside. I'll take my weights outside in the driveway and work out in the driveway. And I do that every single day. I help my wife a little bit in the garden, but that's really her thing. I enjoy watching her succeed at the garden, but I don't do too much of it myself.
All right. Very good.
I like that.
So a lot of my fun is because I travel a lot for work. I go to all these states, all these countries, is trying the food. If I go to a place, I had this great experience. I went to Wisconsin. I went to Waukesha, Wisconsin, and the guy said, "Hey, you want to go out to lunch?" And I said, "Yeah." And he's like, "Do you want to go get sushi? There's a pretty good place." And I was like, "Nope. I want the single most Wisconsin thing you can find for me." And he took me to this little hamburger place called Sobelman's. It's apparently pretty famous. And he got me this big sloppy burger and some kind of local drink that they only make and sell there. And this burger had tater tots and some kind of sauce on it and all this stuff. And it was awesome. So I love going to different places and trying kind of their unique food wherever it is that I'm going. So that's another thing I like to do is try the unique foods in different places. I ate some weird stuff in Japan.
I bet. Yeah,
Have you been to Italy?
I have. I went to Italy in May, and the food there is really good.
Pizza? Is the
Yeah,
pizza and pasta there better than like here?
Oh yeah, total. I mean, there's different styles, right? So like Chicago pizza is its own thing, New York pizza is its own thing, and they're very good. But Italian pizza is real. There's several styles there. A lot of their pizzas in Italy are great big rectangles, and they just cut a piece that's the size that you just show them how big you want it to be. They cut it. It's not a circle. Some of them are circles, but a lot of them are big rectangles. And they just cut a piece. It's fantastic. The food in Italy is unbelievable. The pasta is really, really good. They eat a lot more seafood than I usually eat. And some of it's a little weird, but their food is amazing. Their coffee is amazing. I really like having their coffee drinks in Italy. I had a very good time when I went over there.
Dad, we need to go to Italy.
Okay, we'll put it on our list.
And the gelato. The gelato.
Oh, yes, the gelato.
Everywhere you go, walking around in the cities in Italy, there's gelato stands and little gelato shops, and they're so good.
All right. Well, I guess I'm going to be getting some pressure to go to Italy, but
Yep. All right. So have you ever seen the movie Am I Racist?
Is that the Matt Walsh movie?
Yeah.
I saw some of it, but I didn't see the whole thing.
Did you see the part where he was like, or first of all, I'm going to ask you first. How do you decenter your whiteness?
How do I decenter my whiteness? I don't,
Sorry, Will.
it's actually kind of funny because I think just by like normal life, I technically achieve what that sounds like it means. I got asked one time, I went to breakfast with this education guy and he was pushing this CRT, critical race theory stuff. And I said something and he said, well, did you think about the impact of your white privilege on that decision? And I don't know what caused me to say it, but I looked he's a black fella. I looked him straight in the face and said, sir, I'm a non-practicing white. And he just stared at me for a second, like it's like I'm a non-practicing Catholic or a non-practicing Buddhist or something, like it's a religion. So I'm a non-practicing white. And he stared at me for a second. I said, I don't practice my race. Do you practice yours? And he got really upset. But so, I guess I would say that I do martial arts to decenter my whiteness because the art that I practice is Chinese. But I think it's a super white person thing to do Asian things and then claim that you like know what you're talking about. So maybe that didn't work. That's cultural appropriation. I don't even know. Probably going and eating other foods. No, wait, that's also a very white thing. I can't even do it.
Yeah, it's
I just
difficult.
try not to practice my race in day-to-day life.
That's a good policy. I like it.
I like
I like it.
Yeah, if you treat
Okay.
people like individuals, you turn out to find out that some of them are really cool and some of them aren't, and what they look like or anything else doesn't have a whole lot to do with it.
Yeah, isn't it wild?
After the very recent Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, there was a lot of conspiracy theories, in which Dad actually showed me some of them. And it was some of them are where the government can control the weather. Do you believe that the government can actually control the weather?
Like everything. So with communism or with totalitarianism, there's always this idea of mixing truth and lie. So you tell a little bit of the truth to tell a bigger lie. If you used a fact checker, it wouldn't say true or false. It would say misleading. Not necessarily just the government. People can do things like cloud seeding that actually do influence the weather. You can go fly a plane, and whether it's silver nitrate particles or dry ice particles or whatever, that you can actually cause a humid air mass to develop clouds and possibly rain somewhere sooner than it would have somewhere else. But can you create a gigantic storm? No, probably not. Can you create or move a hurricane? Probably not. Very unlikely. Think of how powerful a hurricane is. You're talking hundreds of miles across. You're talking insanely fast, 150-mile-an-hour winds. You're talking thousands of lightning strikes, tornadoes, so much low pressure in a localized area that it can raise the sea level 15 feet. And so that's an insane amount of energy. As it turns out, that's more energy than the entire world can produce in a year, is roughly what a hurricane's running through. It might be possible to create local low pressure areas of a minor nature that might be able to cause wobbles in a storm system or an air mass. But air masses are gigantic and they're hugely energetic phenomena. The chances are that human beings can generate energy that can compete with what's actually creating that energy, which is the sun. The sun is shining down with incredible irradiance on the surface of the earth, and that's what causes the vast majority of our weather, the weather patterns, and so on. And to think that human beings can create enough energy to compete with that is extraordinarily unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Wow.
Well, and James was studying to be a meteorologist, so this is pretty qualified source here, I think.
Yeah,
This is
really
pretty
good source to
I regret that I ever had
follow.
to think about this.
Very good. Well, why don't we move into our final section? It's short and fun, and we call it rapid fire.
Rapid fire! All right.
And-
So, the rules.
Oh, they're ready.
Yeah, the rules are that you have to answer as fast as possible. No explaining. Okay. What's your favorite junk food?
Ice cream.
Okay. If you had a superpower, what would it be?
To be able to touch a book and understand the book as well as the author.
Would you rather co-author a paper with Klaus Schwab or Dylan Mulvaney?
Klaus Schwab.
Okay. Would you rather dive to a great white shark or flaming hot volcano?
Flaming hot volcano.
Excluding us three, who is your idol?
I was going to say you guys. Let's go with Einstein.
Wow.
Good one.
Would you rather fight a 1,000-pound duck or 1,001-pound ducks?
1,000-pound duck.
What is the coolest invention in your lifetime?
I'm going to have to go with that rocket catching thing Elon Musk just did.
Oh,
That was pretty
yeah,
amazing.
that was cool. Have you ever been stuck in a bathroom stall without toilet paper?
Oh, yeah.
Happened to me 2 times.
The first time I ever stayed, do you guys know what a Ritz-Carlton is?
No.
Yeah.
It's a
nice
really
hotel.
nice, really expensive hotel. First time I ever stayed in a Ritz-Carlton, I got there and I had to go to the bathroom right away. And I went in there and I went to the bathroom because who's ever going to think to look for toilet paper, especially in a Ritz-Carlton? And then I realized here I am in a Ritz-Carlton with no toilet paper.
Tragic.
Oh, wow.
Tragic.
Oh, that is-
First time I ever stayed in this 5-star hotel chain ever.
What did you rate it? That was probably a 4-star then.
Yeah, we got to take a whole star away.
Yeah, we
got
gotta
to
take a
You
star
have
down
to
for
take
that.
a whole star for that.
All
You
right.
passed rapid fire.
That is rapid fire. Well, with that, we can wrap up, James. It was amazing having you on, going into some of these topics that are incredibly complicated and very divisive today. We just thank you for being on.
Yeah.
Hey,
Thank you.
thank you guys.
If you enjoyed this content, please hit that subscribe button, like, share. Until next time.